In this video, we're continuing our focus on improving the quality of our writing, and in this case, we're looking at voicing. The voice we use as a writer is a really important aspect of the tone and feel of the writing that we create. If we want to come across professional, or if we want to come across more casual, the voicing that we use determines the impact that we have. In all of our videos, we've been looking at the common elements that detract from effective writing, and in this case, we'll be looking at D13, D14, and D15. D13 describes inconsistent voicing to suit the purpose, and this is the most common issue that we often see in student writing. A key question to ask yourself here is the voicing of my writing consistent throughout the piece? And am I changing who I'm writing from or who I'm writing to? As an example, we're looking at one extract of text. It reads, "I think that school uniforms should be banned in Australia. You hear about issues with uniform in every school, and removing uniform would prevent these issues from occurring. We should be taking action to make sure our voice is heard. Uniform can compromise a student's sense of identity and compromise mental well-being." You might not notice it straight away, but the four sentences in this extract are actually very different, and they're different because the voicing changes consistently. It starts by stating, "I think that school uniforms should be banned." So it's coming from the writer themselves, and they're using their personal voice. The second sentence reads, "You hear about issues with uniform." So there's an inconsistency in the voicing from one sentence to the next, because instead of talking from myself as the writer, I'm now talking to you as the audience. The third sentence has a similar inconsistency. It says, "We should be taking action." So all of a sudden, where I started as I, and then I was talking to you, now I'm referring to us together as a we, and I go on to talk about our voice later on. The fourth sentence is different again. Uniform can compromise a student's sense of identity. In the fourth sentence, there's no personal language whatsoever. So it's odd that I started with such overtly personal language, but then later on moved to a point where I wasn't using any personal language. In a number of these videos, we've mentioned that consistency is key. The next area we'll look at will be about when is a good time to use personal language, but let's look at how we can improve this piece of writing in this context. A key rule to be mindful of when writing is that if personal language isn't necessary, then there's no reason for it to be there. So you'll notice in this case I've removed all personal language, and in doing that I've made the consistency of the writing the same across all four sentences. Where originally I said I think school uniforms should be banned, I've simply said school uniforms should be banned in Australia. Something we often forget when we're writing, particularly when we write in a similar way to how we speak, is that because we are writing it, it automatically is presented as our opinion. It's the opinion of the writer. So in this case, removing I think didn't change the strength or nature of what I was saying. The second sentence reads, "There are common issues regarding uniform across every school, and the removal of uniform would prevent these issues from occurring." So where I used to say you and talk directly to the reader, in this case I've taken away that personal language. The third sentence reads, "Action should be taken to ensure that public voice is heard regarding this matter." And again, I haven't compromised the consistency of my language by suggesting we should take action. I've phrased that process in what we call the passive voice. You'll hear a little bit more about that later on. You'll see in this case that I haven't changed the fourth sentence, and that's because it was already in a depersonalized mode. But what we can see in this case is that now that all of the sentences have the same voicing, they seem much more effective, consistent, and well written. You need to be really conscious of keeping consistency in the voicing in your writing. And in some cases, I can read 2 paragraphs of a particular style and see something pop up a third paragraph in. So it's not just from sentence to sentence, but it also includes the beginning, middle, and end of an extended text. This brings us into D14, which is a really common thing that we find in student writing, in the overuse of personal language regardless of context. Some key questions we have to ask here are, does adding personal language have a positive impact on the message of my writing? Does the use of personal language suit the tenor of the writing? What kind of relationship am I trying to create with the person reading this information? And does adding personal language accomplish anything that wouldn't be achieved without the language? As a general rule of thumb in written language, adding personal language tends to weaken the strength of what we're saying. So when we look at this extract at the top, I think that people need to be more self-aware, that actually lowers and weakens the modality of that statement, because what you're saying is that the only person who actually agrees with that statement is you as an individual. By simply saying people need to be more self-aware, we make it as a more direct statement of belief, and it's likely to have better impact. In the second sentence of the first sample, it reads, "In my opinion, people don't care enough about how their actions affect others, and I think this needs to stop." When we think about that first question, we ask ourselves, does adding personal language have a positive impact on what I'm trying to say? In this example, I would say that it doesn't. If anything, it actually detracts from the strength of what is being said, because you're locating that point of view specifically to one individual, as opposed to suggesting that it's a more generalised fact. The second example reads more like something we would find in a history book. The First World War began in 1914. You see, there were numerous alliances and obligations between countries that were being stretched and tested. You can imagine that with all the empires expanding across different continents, there was going to be tension. The personal language you see in this case is the inclusion of you. You can see, you can imagine. But adding those words, while directing it to the audience, doesn't actually strengthen what's being said. We might see writing like this in a middle school or primary school textbook about the World War, but if we move into a more professional or sophisticated or higher level textbook, we wouldn't see this personal language. In our improved examples, you can see what I've done to the first sentence. People need to be more self-aware. They don't care enough about their actions and the effect on others, and this needs to stop. By removing the personal language, I've actually strengthened what I was saying, and as well as that, I've been more direct and concise, which we know is a good thing in writing. For the second example, we read, "The First World War began in 1914 as numerous alliances and obligations between countries were being tested. As the major empires sought to expand into wider continents, tension arose between those powers, resulting in increased military action." When we're communicating factual information, we want it to be as depersonalised as possible, because that removes any sense of bias that we are illustrating it from our point of view. Every piece of writing always has an element of bias to it. That's just a natural fact. But we don't need to pronounce that bias by unnecessary inclusion of personal language. D15 relates further to this use of personal language, and in this case we're using the term active language, which is the opposite of something that we call passive language. The key question we have to ask ourselves in this case is, what is most important in my communication? What the action is, or who performs it? Depending on the context of our communication, these questions are really significant, and they can change the way that we structure our entire sentence. A further question to ask is, does including active language take away from what I'm trying to communicate? Let's look at some examples. In this first example, we read, "Farmers collect milk from cows and then they transport it to the dairy to be pasteurised." It reads relatively clearly, but the question we need to ask ourselves is, what is it that we're actually writing about? Is this piece of information about the life of a farmer, or is it answering the question, where does milk come from? If the focus is on the milk, then there's no reason to include who collects the milk. We would focus more on the fact that the milk is collected. So the way that we run this sentence is different depending on what the point of focus is, and this is the difference between the active voice, which focuses on the person who does the action, and the passive voice, which focuses on the action that's being done without worrying who does it. For science, the passive voice is the common expectation of how we write. I've taken this science extract from a piece of student work. For our experiment, we collected samples of liquid and we used Hydrogen pH testing tape to indicate the level of acidity in each liquid. We found that the citrus liquids were the most acidic, while the sugar-based liquids that we tested had a high pH level. In this case, we can see the inclusion of a lot of active language. We collected the samples. We used the testing tape. We found that citrus was most acidic. However, in the field of science, the focus is much more on the processes that have been performed instead of who performed those processes. For this reason, in scientific writing, we always try and remove the active language from communication. Let's see how this changes. You noticed in the first changed example that we've removed the concept of the farmer. No longer is this information about the day in the life of a farmer. Instead, it's now focused on the milk. Milk is collected from cows and transported to the dairy to be pasteurised. There was no need to put that active element in there in order to get this meaning across. The same can be said for the second example. Liquid samples were collected and tested using the pH testing tape to indicate the level of acidity. The citrus liquids were found to be more acidic, while the sugar-based liquids had a higher pH level on average. So you can see where I've removed the personal language here. I've removed any indication of the people who are performing these actions, and I've made the focus purely on the actions themselves and what the result of those actions was. This can be a fine line, but what we need to think about in our writing is whether or not our writing benefits from having active language, or whether it would be more concise, to the point, and effective to focus more on the processes being discussed. Hopefully this video has given you some tips on how to improve the voicing of your writing. Remember that there's other videos you can check out in order to improve the quality of your written work.